Start from the top.
Okay, let's start.
Okay, my name is Michael Cohen. I work in the UC Berkeley Office of Technology Licensing. It's the office that manages all the intellectual property developed on campus. And here's lunch. That is good news. All right. So I've done this seminar for a lot of grad students and new faculty, and I have a few objectives I'd like to achieve. First of all, I want to give you the big picture perspective. I find that just giving a lot of factoids, a lot of it doesn't stick, and when you have something that you think is worth exploring, then call us or call me, and then we'll talk about a lot of the details. Secondly, I want to give you a sense of your responsibilities and also your opportunities as UC Berkeley inventors and software authors. And then finally, at the end of this, you should know, have some sense of what a disclosure is, patents, IP rights agreements, and the general commercialization process at UC Berkeley. And other Thanks. There we go. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think so. It's a red light. Okay. So with that, those objectives in mind, here's the quick agenda. I'll talk about how the university leverages IP to catalyze commercialization. I'll just give you some case studies and how innovations get commercialized at research universities like Berkeley. Talk about license, patents, and disclosures. And finally, there's something that I call the Berkeley way, and that is how we manage the IP terms of research agreements and also how we manage invention disclosures. And for you people that have been at other universities, you might find this interesting. And then Q&A. By the way, feel free to ask me questions during the discussion just to make this more.
May I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Lunch is here, so if people want to get up to get lunch, please spend a couple minutes.
Oh, sure. You want to take or you want to like maybe get up in phases so that we can. Why don't we? You want to do that? Like this part of the room?
Okay,
Yeah. Right.
that
way I'll keep going and.
Yeah.
Right. Good.
Do
No, I'm fine. Okay, so let me start with the offices and the university's objective in managing IP. We try to leverage the university's intellectual property rights to catalyze two things. One, the commercialization of these innovations for the benefit of society, to fund research and education on campus, and also to reward the researchers for their ingenuity. We also try to manage the IP so that it encourages funding of UC Berkeley research agreements. So often we have to reconcile the IP interest of the companies that fund research with the IP policies and practices of the university. Try to reconcile that. But this is, they call this tech transfer. That's a big misnomer. It's nothing about transferring technology. The way you transfer technology, you publish papers, you give presentations, you consult for companies, you hire students. That's how you transfer. This is about catalyzing when it's done well. Okay. So this is my partial list of well over 100 startups that have IP rights agreements from the university. And this doesn't include a lot of the spin-outs that are quite successful that did not have any patent or copyright software coming out of the university. So it's quite a list, and there's a lot of some really interesting big names in there. And likewise, here's the list of top generating IP licenses. And one of the striking things about this list is that the variety of IP goes from software to nanotechnology to biofuels. So Berkeley is quite a diversified university in that respect, whereas other universities tend to have a focus.
The previous list was not just companies started by UC people, but those that are licensed in technology developed here. Right.
So it's a good point in that some of them, for example, may not actually have any UC Berkeley people, but they just license the IP rights. And I'll tell you how that works and then when I talk about the patterns for how these things get commercial. That's a good question. And by the way, so this doesn't include things like SPICE, setting up the electronic design automation industry, because that wasn't really licensed for, and it doesn't include how Unix started the scientific computing industry. So a lot of these things aren't on this list because I just tracked IP rights. So here's kind of the challenge of getting things commercialized at research universities like Cal. On this axis here, we have the risk required to commercialize the technology, and on this axis is the potential return on that investment. And because UC Berkeley is a research university, not a product company, the fact of the matter is that most of the innovations have a relatively high risk to commercialize and a relatively low return, so that for a lot of investors and companies, these innovations don't get above the line to get the investments required. So when we're managing the IP rights correctly, we can take an innovation right here that doesn't have the risk-return profile to get investment, and we can give like a company exclusive rights that improve their business model and get that innovation above the line so that it gets funding to commercialize. And likewise, sometimes we can license innovations non-exclusively to lower the risk that you're infringing on someone's rights. And again, that helps get over the line. And again, that's all about catalyzing the commercialization, not transferring technology. So with that in mind, I've studied well over how 50 innovations from UC Berkeley have been commercialized by both large corporations and young companies. And it's interesting, when you look at the stories, they form 4 patterns that I call morphed, mined, milked, and marketed. And I'll give you an example of each of these, and I think you'll find it interesting in terms of your research teams. So the morphed pathway occurs when members of a research team organically evolve from the research to a prototype. Before you know it, they got a beta product, and they're starting a company very organically. And this often happens with technologies that don't require a lot of capital to commercialize. For example, internet services and software. You don't have to build big semiconductor plants and things like that to do it. And so there's a lot of very good examples here. For example, goodguide.com. If you go to goodguide.com, that was a research team that figured out how to combine a bunch of databases to enable consumers to get the ultimate information on any consumer products, environmental stats, sustainability stats, and so forth. So that guide is now available on the internet and at the point of sale. And that team kind of morphed out of the university. The professor actually took a year off. They started in downtown Berkeley. When they're ready to launch, they got money and they moved to San Francisco. And now they're off and running with about 50 employees. The mind pathway for commercialization is actually the fastest growing segment on this campus, largely due to the advent of the Haas Business School's focus on entrepreneurial students. This occurs when entrepreneurs on campus periodically scour the campus for innovations that they want to use either in classrooms or business plan competitions or just to start companies. And when they strike an innovation that interests them, they form a team, they write a business plan, often they enter a competition, and a lot of them then spawn companies. And a lot of good examples here. For example, Aduratech is working on lighting, wireless lighting networks for buildings to improve building energy efficiency. And I hooked them up with a team that was doing this work. And sure enough, they won a business plan competition in 2006. They started in the incubator in the basement of the Bancroft Hotel adjacent to the campus. And then when they got funding, they're off and running now and have going concern. The milked pathway occurs because there's a growing amount of corporate-sponsored research on campus, and a lot of times the innovations of part of that collaborative research just get brought into the company as part of their R&D efforts, and the company thereby commercializes it. And there's some good examples of this. One is Ecoprene, a company called Excel Tech Group funded algae research to create biofuels with Professor Tassios Melis. And they came up with some innovations related to isoprenes production. And so that company created a business unit called Ecoprene, and now they're trying to commercialize that innovation within the corporate construct.
Is the corporate research sponsor owned patents and stuff?
Good question. So,
The question is
good. The question is, does the corporation own the IP? And almost in all cases, in theory, it doesn't. And ideally, the way it works is that if it was developed purely by the researchers from UC Berkeley, then the university owns it, and we license it to the company. If it was jointly owned if it was jointly developed by members of the company and the university, then we both own our rights to it, and sometimes the company will license our rights to get a total exclusive on it. But I can tell you that there's probably a lot of cases where the IP is never disclosed and kind of, I won't say absconded with, but it's just, we can't track it, and we certainly don't police it. And so, you never know what's going on with the IP, and so we have so many other things to focus on. We don't police this. But I should not be so facetious. Often it works well. They disclose the invention, we license the IP, and they commercialize it. So we all live happily ever after. And then the final pathway of the 4 M's is the marketed pathway, and this comes back to your earlier question. So a lot of times innovations developed on campus are too early for commercialization. The technology is not proven, the markets are too nascent or whatever. So sometimes because the innovations have such great potential, we'll actually go and patent them at our cost, and then we'll periodically market them on the web to venture capital firms, serial entrepreneurs, and companies. And sure enough, eventually, sometimes we find a good fit, and the timing's ready, and it takes off. There's several examples of this. One of my favorite examples is Luminous Devices. They are making solid-state lighting, LED lighting, and they and EECS faculty worked out a way to, it's called laser liftoff. It's a way to make the circuits more cost-effectively. And so when Luminous Devices, based outside of Boston, was aware of the technology, they licensed it, and now they're becoming a successful LED company. They're actually one of our fastest-growing revenue generators right now. So those are the 4 M's. And you might see some of those dynamics in your research teams. So now let's move from commercialization and catalyzing commercialization to the licenses themselves. So the purpose of the license is to give these companies the rights to use the technology or the copyrightable software. There's a lot of flavors of licenses. There's exclusive and non-exclusive. There's all kinds of field of use demarcations. There's all kinds of sub-licensing. So while it's one word, it's actually a relatively rich area for negotiations and contracting. There's several elements to a license agreement. There's the financial part, which may include royalties and fees and so forth. There's legal stuff that often is dictated by the Office of the President, is true for all the UC campuses, that clarify that there's no warranties, that we're indemnified, and there's confidentiality. And then there's finally operational milestones, and this is key because, again, our objective is to get the technology commercialized fast and broadly. And so if a company decides to shelve the innovation because they have, for example, they might have they might prefer their own technology, then that doesn't achieve our objective. And so we'll have operational milestones in there. It says if they don't commercialize it by a certain date, then we can repatriate the IP and then license it to another company. And so those can be key. A lot of people ask me about the pricing for licenses. I just had a call the other day from someone who was interested in some of the AC sensor technology that developed in the ECS department, and one of his first questions is how much is it going to cost? And what we often do is we work with the company to create a financial terms that makes sense for the company. If it's a startup, it might involve equity. If it's a large company, it might be more license fees. And so there's no set price that is easily just to say. One thing we can say categorically is this is quite a machine here now. We've done a lot of licenses, and a lot of them are funded by top venture capital firms. So we know the parameters of what's required to make these startups work. And I think a lot of, when I work with jointly owned technology from other universities, like in the middle of the country, they don't get it yet. That the innovation is just a small piece of the commercialization effort, and you can't. These startups need a lot of cash to keep it going. You can't rob them of that just because you think you have a great innovation. So we have a very progressive mindset in that respect. Yeah, good point. So inventors, especially the new faculty, get about a third of the proceeds, and then a third goes to your department, and often that's funneled back to your lab. And then the remainder goes to the campus, and if we're lucky, they help us fund our office. So one more thing about licensing, there are actually several steps that we can use to license IP, and it's all based, again, on this kind of commitment as a function of risk. And there's so many risk factors along the way for these startups. Is it viable? Was it cost effective? What are the competition? And even whether the IP is good, because it can take years to get a patent. So we can take some baby steps that are quite amenable to some of these startups. I've just done, for example, 3 letter agreements, IP rights letter agreements in the past month to startups. And what it is it's basically a 2-page agreement that gives that startup about 6 to 12 months of rights so that they can continue to evaluate the potential here. And it's a very easy agreement to do because you don't require lawyers and things like that. But then there's an option agreement that's about 10 or 20 pages, and there's this full license agreement that's a full 30-page document that often they have to have legal representation and things like that. And so that's kind of a way we manage that risk and help these young companies get involved. Okay, so talked about commercialization, talked about licenses. Now let's talk about patents a little bit. So, in IP in general. There's four types of, you can categorize intellectual property in four areas. One is patent rights, the other one is copyrightable software, trade secrets, and know-how. I want to emphasize one thing, that university employees, researchers, faculty, you own your own know-how. And that's the kind of, the intangible kind of parts of innovation that you can't write down, you can't patent, and that's often a big part of the value added that people coming from a university bring to a company, the know-how, not necessarily the patent rights. University doesn't have many trade secrets because in general, this is a research university and publishing is a key part of it. So it's actually awkward when some inventors talk about just keeping some innovation a trade secret, not publishing it, and then also not patenting it, but just kind of using it. So I try to talk them down from that. Then there's copyrightable work. So you of course you own your own publications, that kind of works of art. But the software that you develop is considered like patents, part of the university's IP. The purpose of the patent is give you the patent holders a legal monopoly in exchange for publishing it, and so that in theory helps with commerce because everyone's learning about everyone else's innovations. It's created by government. So here's an interesting thing. With the growth of the commercial sector in China and India and in Brazil and so forth, a lot of inventors that I work with want to patent stuff in those regions, but the patent is only as good as the courts in that country's ability to fulfill the patent and prosecute infringers. So sometimes in those countries, if we go after an infringer and that infringer happens to be a domestic company like in China or Brazil, they don't often they aren't sympathetic to this U.S. entity trying to stop a domestic entity from the commercial success. So my point is it often doesn't make sense to spend all those patent costs in regions that don't have strong courts to manage, to enforce patent rights. Timing, this is a key thing here in that, your first enabling public disclosure is a key milestone in the patent strategy process. And you have, in the U.S., you have 1 year after that first enabling public disclosure to file a patent. And in other countries, you can't file a patent once you've made that enabling public disclosure. So that's something to keep in mind. And often we use this notion of a provisional patent. It's kind of a baby patent application to put a placeholder in place for the IP, and then we have a year from then to transition that into a full non-provisional patent application. Patents are expensive. For a normal patent application, it's like $15,000 to start with, and and that doesn't even include all the subsequent work to get it through the patent office. So, but these provisional patents are only about $1,000, or in that range. Question.
You mentioned the term being from the filing date. Wasn't there some change where now it's from the issue date?
Did I make a mistake?
I think that is the change.
Yeah, this might be an outdated slide. Yeah.
It used to be 17 years from the issue date, and now it was recently changed to 20 years from the filing date.
There it is right there.
Is that correction?
Yes.
There's a lot of changes that are in the works, but none of them have been approved yet. But in terms of, in the U.S., it's first to invent. In other countries, it's first to file, and they're thinking of making it first to file in the U.S. So that creates certain dynamics that, if it happens, it will affect the dynamics of universities in terms of sharing information. One other thing, it's very easy to get a patent. It's hard to get a good patent. If you can narrow the claims, you can probably patent a lot of things, but that's not useful in terms of commercialization. Which brings me to discussion of the value of the patents, the IP, to companies. From the exclusive license to non-exclusive, the best value from a good patent is it gives the company competitive barriers that improve their risk return. Then actually a step down from there is, and this is relatively common surprisingly, is the optics. It gives the startup some impressive credentials when they say they've licensed IP exclusively from a university like UC Berkeley or MIT or Stanford, and so it helps with getting funding that way. And then there's other reasons, for sub-licensing and cross-licensing and so forth. And sometimes we try to work out a way to patent something so that we can help integrate into an industry standard. For example, I'm working with some professors on that in the wireless cellular space to see if this IP could be a potential part of the emerging standards. Okay, so we talked about commercialization, licensing, patenting. Now let's talk about invention disclosures. Disclosure is required by a couple things. Often your funding agreement has a provision that says that you should disclose your inventions to the university, and the university often has to then disclose it to the U.S. government or the corporation funding it. Also, as part of your employment agreement, that's kind of another area that it asks you to disclose your inventions in copyrightable software. And then the purpose of this disclosure form, one of the things I overhauled it a year or two ago, and it's really, so it's not intended to be a bureaucratic, rock-fetching exercise. Everything on there is important to our strategy and plan for the IP. Like, who is the funding entity? It helps us understand whether there are any encumbrances. Who are the inventors? It helps us understand whether there's a company or another university that's a joint owner. So everything on there is legitimate and not just a lot of just bureaucratic work. It helps us understand the bar dates I mentioned earlier about when the first enabling public disclosure has been or will be targeted, and all the other stuff here. So another thing about the disclosure form is not a patent or a patent application. It's just like it's just the first step. And so a lot of people get very hung up on whether it's complete or whether you have all the inventors, and if you have too many or not enough. And it's a process. So often an invention disclosure might result in multiple patent filings, or sometimes the inventorship might change based on how the patent office is responding to the claims in a patent. So it's just kind of a process, and I try to encourage the inventors to file, to submit the disclosure early, and just have us start to work with you on the right stuff here. And often it's a good first step, because I've worked with some innovations, especially in the software area, where there's a lot of excitement. And they say, okay, you haven't got around to filing an invention disclosure, but let me start working with you on it. We start talking to companies and things, and there's something related to carbon footprint calculators at the university here. And we were working on licensing that. And sure enough, eventually when they submitted the software disclosure, we learned that they were using code from CMU, and that code was encumbered. And so all the work we did to eventually, all the licensing strategy was irrelevant, because we had to get rights from CMU, and they had a different view on what to do with the software. So that's why it's good to really get that invention disclosure in early, so that we can start working with you on it.
So where can you find that form?
Good question. If you go to the website, IPIRA, berkeley.edu, and then there's a place for employees, and then under that, if you click on that, then there's a big place for disclosures, software disclosures, invention disclosures. We also have, I should mention this, something called a preliminary disclosure form. So let's say that you're consulting with a company, and you think that you've created an innovation that the university should not own. And furthermore, you don't want to really disclose it to us because it's very confidential to you and the company. This preliminary disclosure form allows us just to get some idea of what it is, so that we can start to make the right decision on what we're about to talk about, which is ownership here. So one thing about the disclosure, that's not an admission that the university owns this innovation. Often inventors can say they would like the university to disclaim or waive rights to that innovation, because for various reasons. And we've been very flexible in that area. So if you think that the innovation did not use any UC Berkeley resources, or none of the work came from funding from the university, and it was really not part of your scope of your work, then you can be very transparent about it, submit the invention disclosure to the university, ask for a waiver or disclaimer, and then often we'll concur with that. Usually we'll talk to your department chair or dean to get their concurrence, and then you have a legal document saying that you have rights to this. If that doesn't happen, and you're working on the IP, and you start a company, the company's quite successful, and then maybe you're going public, and then all of a sudden the attorneys are looking at what you're doing, in your IPO statement, and they realize, wow, you developed this innovation at the university, but you never licensed it, and so often sometimes they'll have to go back and get that license. And Line Wafer is a good example of that story. So we talked about 35% goes to the inventors. The assumption is that it's split evenly, but if you want to work it out with your team that it's not an even split, if you send that in writing, we'll do it that way. When we're looking at licensing alternatives, if members of the team are spinning out a company, that's often the highest candidate for this kind of license because, again, they're bringing know-how, not just the IP rights, and so that's, we want to encourage that. So often members of the team will be part of the spin-out company. Talked about ownership, and if you want, if in a case where you submit an invention disclosure and and we decide not to patent it, we can return it to you, and so you can do what you want with it. Often what we'll do is just ask the funding agency if they want the IP rights. Often, like the government agency will say no, and so then you can have rights to your patent.
So on the third bullet, what does C mean? Scope of employment?
Yes. Right. So let's just say that you didn't use university resources like some big laboratory equipment that's not de minimis. The work wasn't funded by some kind of contract with the government or company, but it's a key part of your scope of employment. Then, which is a little ambiguous, but and that has evolved. That language has evolved a little bit recently. So that's kind of an area for discussion. And there's certain examples of like faculty that were serving on PhD advisory groups, and they learned about innovations as part of that, and that's kind of part of the scope of their work because they were part of that. And so there was some debate about whether they should have the rights to take it, even though because it was they invented it as part of their scope of their work. So that is kind of a subtle clause in here. Did I answer your question as well as I can?
Finding things from the past.
Yeah.
Has that language been added somewhat recently?
No, it's been changed. It used to, instead of saying scope of employment, it used to say, can't remember offhand, but it was this scope was deliberately, it was wordsmithed to be a little bit more, I think, favorable to faculty, frankly. And so, what is scope of employment? That's subject to definition. And I guess one of the things I want to emphasize here is that UC Berkeley is, again, a very progressive, kind of easygoing environment. And if you have a case that your chair or your dean will support, unless it's just strikingly fraudulent, I think that you're going to, it's going to work. And so that's for you. And in fact, I believe that kind of management should come from the chain of the faculty and the chairs and deans, and it shouldn't be overseen by the IP management office. Our role is not to police you; it's really to more advise you and help you. And so that's why you'll be able to work it out with your faculty, support, as opposed to trying to convince some staff person that what your employment is. Does that answer your question?
Well, that's very good when you said that. No, my question is about the timing of that, because I know that document has changed several times over the course of years, and I'm just trying to understand. Obviously, you're presenting it to us now in the way it currently is, and I'm trying to remember what the changes are. And I think some of the changes, if I may differ with you, have not been in favor of the faculty. They've actually been in favor of the way that the new agreements are more stringent than the old agreements.
Oh, really?
The last bullet, did you cover that?
Let's see.
If UC decides not to file?
Yeah, so I'll cover that again because if we decide not to file it, then there's a process for which we first give the funding agency the right to patent it, and if they choose not to, then we can give it back to the inventors to decide with the patent on their own. And the funding agencies will almost never decide to patent it, so that's the default process is it gets back to the inventorship. There is a subtle conflict here that I was on the campus conflict of interest committee for a long time with Sujay, and in theory, if you own a patent and then you do work that somehow helps you enrich the financial potential of that patent, that can be considered kind of a conflict of interest of using university and public resources for private gain. Now, one of the things that we learned on just because you have a conflict doesn't mean it can't be managed, and then you continue to do it. But you just should be aware that if you choose to take ownership of the invention and patent it, and it's related to your research, you might want to be transparent about how your research is helping that patent. These are the kind of complexities that, again, if this happens, you should call me. And then, because I don't know if you're going to remember this in 2 or 3 years, but And again, I feel like my job is just to advise you, and we're not here to police you or to. So that's why you should feel open to calling us. So just to give you some perspective, there's a huge amount of know-how generated on this campus, and then there's some disclosures, and then there's we choose to patent only a small percentage of the disclosures. Only a small percentage of those patents result in licenses. Only a small percentage of those companies actually make products, and only a small percentage of that results in revenue. And even that revenue, a lot of it's not a significant amount. So maybe that is one reason why we're pretty easygoing. The realization that there's compared to, for example, sponsored research, the amount of proceeds we get from licensing IP is quite a bit smaller, and so that gives you perspective in how you manage the IP and in the easygoing nature of Berkeley. Which brings me to the final two key points here is how we this what I call a research-oriented approach to managing IP, which is different than a university that would have a licensing-oriented approach to managing IP. So there's three elements the way there's an impact. For example, when we're establishing the terms of sponsored research agreements, the IP terms, in the licensing-oriented university, often we try to control the IP. The university tries to control the IP and tries to maximize revenue from that. Here, I feel like we work with the PI. And if the PI wants the funding and is willing to accept some egregious IP terms, as long as the university that doesn't break policy, as long as we can manage it, then we usually go along, and what we then do is use this agreement called an informed consent agreement, which tells anyone on that research team that okay, this is not a standard way of managing your IP according to the agreement, so you're warned, and you can't sue us in the future for saying that we didn't effectively license your IP. So that's kind of the approach of working with a PI as opposed to just trying to maximize licensing. In disclosing innovations developed by researchers, some universities there's kind of a police mentality. They go into the campus and the labs, and they look for they compel the researchers to disclose inventions. Here, we get a lot of disclosures as it is, and so we're just not aggressively compelling people to disclose. Though when they ask me, I just do advise them of their obligations under their employment agreement and the research agreement, and then it's up to them to make use their own discretion. In developing the IP strategy for innovation, so a lot of universities, when you disclose an invention, they take it and say, okay, we'll take it from here, and they decide on their own IP strategy and patent plans. Here, I like to work with the inventor team, and often they have some good ideas about potential licensing candidates and strategy and fields of demarcation. And so I feel like we have much more of an interactive way of working with the inventor teams to manage the IP. And one thing you can't do is you can't sit at the table and work with us on the financial terms. That becomes kind of a conflict. But but you can work with us on the strategy and the planning. And so then again, another part of the researcher-oriented approach to managing IP, again, as opposed to a licensing-oriented approach. So I find that faculty range from some faculty are completely indifferent about what we do with their IP. Some are adamant about open sourcing, say if they have software IP, and others are really interested in making money on their licensing IP. So a lot of times I think the right approach is to let that drive some of our decisions up here. So for example, if someone wants us to waive or disclaim ownership in their innovation, the first thing we'll just do is check with us, who funded the research and see if there are any conflicts with that, and then we'll confer with the inventor team and see if there are any special circumstances, and often we'll comply. And likewise, if you develop software and you want to open source it, again, we'll just make sure that there's no conflicts with the people that funded that agreement, and then we'll open source it. I don't think I can recall a case where there was an innovation that just had so much revenue potential, and the inventors or authors didn't want to license it, and we had a conflict with that. So again, this is part of that research-oriented approach to managing IP, not a licensing-oriented approach. So it's kind of a fast-talking summary of the objectives, the Berkeley way of research-oriented approach to IP, how innovations get commercialized here, how we catalyze the commercialization by leveraging IP rights, and then you should have a bit of familiarity with licenses, patents, and disclosures. Any questions? This is, by the way, this is the URL that I mentioned earlier. And then here's another thing that I encourage you to do. If you are kind of on the entrepreneurial side of the campus, we started this thing called the Berkeley Startup Cluster, and it does a lot of things, including offer you space nearby that it's easy for you to move into if you spin out of the campus, and also some networks for getting funding and things like that.
I have a question.
Sure.
As I said earlier, I come from the corporate world,
Right.
and from a purchasing perspective, buying software, part of my file contained a signed NDA. And as a matter of fact, we had files and files of NDA, so someone tracked the expiration date and all of those kinds of things. But I never see an NDA mentioned nor part of the file.
So because it's the university, confidentiality agreements are can be hard to enforce. So for example, when faculty ask me if they should sign a confidentiality agreement, an NDA, when they're talking to a corporation about potentially getting funding, I advise them that's not the ideal thing to do, because they're in the world of publishing and collaboration, and the corporation might not have the same mindset. So I think it's problematic for faculty to sign confidentiality agreements. We would never sign them in our office, like venture capital firms.
But even sometimes the federal government is requiring that for faculty to attend certain meetings and things like that. So I think it's becoming more and more common, but I think it's often on the PI, the professor, to decide.
Right.
What is this limited, time factor, and just a particular meeting or presentation?
Right. And that's also the case with our own consortium, like BSAC has certain confidentiality windows of time, and we've worked that out with the companies. So often it's managed or mitigated by just there's a window of time, and so that's the compromise we came to there. So.
Again, in corporate America, typically anyone going to another company, anyone stepping into my company to ask directions, the 7-Eleven signs an NDA.
Yeah, right. Not here. This is a university. It's all about dissemination of information, not the confidentiality of information. Nonetheless, there's times when it's useful. And by the way, the license agreements are considered confidential. Of course, Public Record Acts force us to disclose them when someone files those. So nothing's really confidential, actually, under Public Records Acts, I've learned recently. Yeah, right. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, so there's, once you file a disclosure, an innovation disclosure, what's the process you take to make the decision if the university is going to act on it or not?
So what will happen is it'll come into the office. One of the IP managers will take the case. They'll go through the disclosure, see what the deadlines are, what is the timeline for when it was or will be disclosed, public enabling disclosure. They'll talk to the inventors about the potential of licensing it. We'll look at the funding agreements to see if it's encumbered. Like, for example, a lot of ECS faculty get funded through NRC and what's the MIT, Marco and things like that, and we find those agreements really impede the ability to license the IP effectively. And so it doesn't make sense for us to spend money on patenting. So again, we look at the funding, the timelines, the inventorship, sometimes if it's jointly owned. So we look at all those factors, talk to the inventors, and then come up with a decision that seems to make sense. Sometimes the decision is, let's post a non-enabling description of that innovation on the web and send it to people and see what the response is from the industry. And if the response is strong and we have some time, we'll assess that. And then when the deadlines come up for patenting, then we'll make a decision then. So a lot of it depends on the deadline for the patenting, how much time we have in terms of filing.
And normally the time between a patent being filed and the interest for licensing the patent is quite long.
And that's one of the challenges.
You would expect that the research is really
Right.
cutting edge. So how do you...
That's a key challenge here. So when the feedback from the industry is inconclusive, and the patent deadline is approaching, and there's some discussion that this innovation has a lot of potential, on occasion, what we'll do is at-risk filing. So we'll take university budget and file the patent, and hopefully that it will be licensed, and then that money will be paid back from the proceeds of the licensing. And so that happens, maybe 5% of the disclosures.
In regards to that process of determining whether or not the university wants to patent something after it's been disclosed, is there a shift at all in the last few years where we're suffering budget cuts that perhaps you're looking a little more closely before you decide to patent, and that's likely to happen the year before?
Yes. If you go to the website, you can go to my webpage. I did some annual reports last 2 years when I was running the office, and we were facing typically the office is self-funded, but there were some key licenses that were expiring, and we were looking at big deficits. And then the campus is looking at a big macro deficit in the state. So we try to impose a little bit more discipline in the patent decision process, and I instituted a protocol and some other decision-making, a group decision-making process. And also we at times use this notion of inventor finance patenting, where sometimes the inventors have some funding that's not you can use for discretionary uses, and sometimes we have used that to pay for the patents. And then, of course, that gets paid back first when there's licensing that comes from it. Unrestricted funds. Well, good. So again, you can send me an email at mike.c@berkeley.edu, and then if you have any specific questions, I encourage you to follow up.
Thanks very much,
All right,
Mike.
thanks.
Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.